From London, I'm Rochelle Travers, and this is The Standard. A special investigation from The Standard has uncovered the horrifying reality of misogyny and how it's impacting women and girls. Teenage girls aged between 13 to 15 say they are victims of sexual harassment every day, online, in the street, and even in the classroom. David Cohen, our investigations editor and campaigns editor, went into some London schools to find out what exactly is happening and how we can make our women and girls feel safe. So, David, The Standard has carried out a special investigation into violence against women and girls. Why is it such an important issue at the moment?
So, for several reasons, femicide has been rising quite precipitously in the UK. According to police data, there is about 120% rise in knife crime and threats and killings of women. And in some counties like Essex, that rise has been 400%. We were particularly interested in the wake of Andrew Tate and his sort of toxic influence particularly on social, to look at how is this affecting the way boys talk about girls when there are no adults in the room. And how is it affecting the way girls talk about boys talking about girls when there are no adults in the room? And so we set up some workshops where we could approximate that as closely as possible, sort of being a fly on the wall, workshops in schools with 13 to 15-year-olds, firstly with boys and secondly with girls. And then I did some with them coming together, where they were moderated and certain key questions were asked. And they would basically, the idea is they would sort of forget that I was there after a while, which they did. And we went into two schools, one in Croydon and one in Lambeth. And what we found was truly, truly shocking, particularly for parents of girls, I think, to see what they have to endure, what they say they have to endure on a daily basis.
And what exactly is happening in our country's classrooms then?
So this is in the classroom, in the corridor, in the playground, and in the streets. In Croydon, they did a survey which showed that half of women and girls say they do not feel safe walking around their own neighborhood. This is in parks, in shopping centers, waiting for the bus. It's nothing like the Sarah Everard story of walking home at night. We're just talking about in the daytime, in their neighborhood, half not feeling safe. And we asked girls, how do they feel? Do they feel safe in the classroom? And they said to us, look, harassment has become a daily occurrence for us. They are rated for their looks and how they dress on a daily basis. Boys admit to this too. They say, look, it's entertainment, it's fun. Sometimes you feel bad. Some of them said, yes, it's sexist. But none of them felt so bad that they said they wouldn't do it. There is a shocking amount of inappropriate images being passed around. That was one of the things that really, really struck me. Almost all the boys and all the girls said this was quite normalized. And this is girls in their school, quite often in their classroom, where inappropriate images get passed around or they're all looking at. And that, actually passing on images is illegal. And so that was made very clear to the boys by the moderator. But so that was another thing that the girls talked about. And there's a whole sort of lexicon for rating girls that becomes apparent. A whole sort of language. This will change depending on which part of London you're at, but you could be regarded as leng, which is attractive, or peng, attractive and sexy, or meaty, which is ugly. Girls are having to sort of negotiate this territory all the time, things being shouted at to them by boys they barely know, or girls told us about boys talking to them about their sexual fantasies with that girl, with a girl who didn't fancy that guy, and having to hear stuff which this boy thought that he could impart, the thoughts or dreams that he has been having. And what was really interesting is that in the girls' session that we did, there was the head of Year 9 who was a young teacher. She was 27, so she's almost double the girls' age. It's a while since she was their age and at school. But she's a relatively young teacher compared to the staff. And towards the end of the session, she had been quiet the whole session, and she said, I had no idea this was going on. No idea the extent to which girls are assailed in our classrooms, in our schools. She said it was amazing to create the safe space to hear these things, that boys need re-education and that the girls need these safe spaces, and that basically calling for more healthy relationships workshops in schools. And, she was saying, she asked the girls, she said, is it easier to call out racism in school than sexist abuse? And everyone said absolutely. That was, for some reasons, racism and also homophobic abuse has been very well flagged by schools. It's not tolerated, and everybody knows where they stand. But with sexist abuse, it's much more grey areas, and girls feel much less emboldened to call it out.
Let's go to the ads. Coming up in part 2,
the rise of Andrew Tate. He came on the scene about 18 months to 2 years ago. If you ask, have you heard of Andrew Tate, the classroom just erupts.
The Standard podcast will be back in just a moment. Welcome back. Still with me is The Standard's investigations editor and campaigns editor, David Cohen. David, do we know what is driving this misogynistic behaviour?
So one of the big concerns of schools, and they've started to have these special assemblies to address it, is the rise of Andrew Tate. Now, we are starting to see a little bit of his influence waning because of his arrest in Romania. But I'd say he came on the scene about 18 months to 2 years ago. And when you mention his name in these sessions to the young boys and the girls, firstly, if you ask, have you heard of Andrew Tate, the classroom just erupts. This is a group of young boys who until then had been quite quiet in the session, some of them more voluble than others. And when you ask the girls, they say to a person that his influence has changed the playing field. It's been horrendous. So he, for example, thinks it's okay to choke women during sex, or he's been said to say so. And girls were saying how when they push back against some of the abuse that they get or some of the harassment, they get told things like, oh, if you don't shut up or if you're not careful, we'll choke you. So they sort of have appropriated Andrew Tate type terminology and talk and have used it, the girls say, in quite a creepy way to advance themselves. Now, not all boys, I would say only about half the boys say they support or feel Andrew Tate is a positive role model, but a lot of his influence is much more under the radar, I think. And the other thing we came across, we asked the boys, how young were you when you first accessed porn? And that was very poignant because the boys were very honest, and they said, one boy told about how he was 7 years old when he first. So he said, I was tricked into it. A friend showed me people having sex online. I didn't even know what I was seeing. And then they all started saying, I was 8, I was 9, I was 10, very young. And the girls said to us too, the boys have accessed porn way too young, and it's really had an impact on the way they think girls should be and the way they think they should be. And a lot of the boys, for example, said they felt a peer pressure to rate girls, and that calling out other boys was potentially dangerous. They said, you could get stabbed up if, for example, you saw a girl down an alley surrounded by boys demanding her Snapchat handle. She said you would have to be either brave or stupid to call out those boys. You could get stabbed up. The girls said, from their point of view, boys are very scared to take on other boys because of violence against the violence I've just described. but sometimes feel very relaxed about being aggressive towards girls because they know that's very, very, very unlikely to be stabbed as a result of that.
And the Standard is calling on the government to take action on these issues. What are we asking for?
So this actually comes up to the third spread we have in the Evening Standard today, which actually looks at – so there's been a big rise in exclusions in the last 4 years. Massive, really. Exclusions have gone up by 95% in the last 5 years, and 232,000 high school children were excluded in the spring term of 2023. That was the last term for which figures have been published. This is the highest on record for a single term in a generation. But how many of these rising exclusions is violence against girls? So we asked the Department for Education, and they haven't a clue. And the reason is they've got 16 categories under which a head teacher can suspend or permanently exclude a child. But sexist abuse and violence against girls isn't one of them. Now, that doesn't mean that sexist abuse or violence against girls will not result in a person being excluded. It's just that they'll be excluded under a generalized catch-all classification of verbal abuse or physical abuse or bullying. But unlike racist abuse, which has its own category, abuse relating to disability has its own category, abuse against sexual orientation and gender identity has its own category, it means that you can track whether those categories of abuse are rising, falling, or stable. We have no ability through the DFE's categorization of exclusion to track or measure sexist abuse, sexual harassment, and violence against girls. And we are calling, like campaigners, we are calling for this to be remedied immediately, and that a new category is created, a 17th category, if you like, so that we can now start to track and measure sexist abuse.
You can find out more about the Standard's special investigation into violence against women and girls in our newspaper or via our website, standard.co.uk. And that's it from this episode. This podcast is back tomorrow at 4 p.m.